Welcome back to everyone joining us today. For those new to this series of webinars between our institute and the Australian Embassy in Colombia, my name is Andrea Calle, Project Manager at the Instituto de Ciencia Política Hernán Echavarría Olózaga. Today, we will be discussing modern economic statecraft, theory and case studies of China's global influence. We are honored to welcome Mrs. Helen Mitchell, an economist and former Australian diplomat. Mrs. Mitchell is a Sir Roland Wilson Scholar at the Australian University's National Security College. She is a senior expert providing strategic advice to the Prime Minister and other government officials. Mrs. Mitchell has developed a modern economic statecraft framework to shed light on state actions that can drive prosperity while increasing regional deterrence and influence. Welcome, Mrs. Mitchell.
Well, muchas gracias, Andrea. Estoy encantada de hablar contigo, but I'm also very happy to talk about this research in the excellent English that you have. I'm really pleased to be here.
Great. I didn't know you could speak Spanish, but that's great. We're going to conduct this interview in English, but if at any point you feel free to speak in Spanish. Okay. First of all, thank you for being here with us. And to dive into the questions right away, recently we had read that you published a paper titled Unlocking Economic Security, a Strategic Playbook for Australia. And to start this conversation, I would like to ask you if you could share your definition of economic security and the essential elements needed to understand it.
Great. Yes, this is a question that is still contested. We're still working out what economic security looks like today. We, both in Australia and in Colombia and in other countries as well. Something I've noticed in my research is that this isn't actually fundamentally a new question. Countries have been thinking about their international economic exchange of resources, things like trade in goods, services, things like flows of people and money and ideas across borders for a very long time. But what is different at the moment is that we have a very interconnected global economy. We know, for example, that things like the cell phones, the iPhones we all use today are the product of really intricate global supply chains that cross borders all around the world. So you might hold in your hand your cell phone and there's parts in it that were made in Taiwan and Japan, in Asia. There were parts and design features from the United States. There may have been inputs from Colombia at some point along the way as well. There'll be critical minerals and resources in there, certainly from places like Australia and parts of Africa. And there'll be assembly and packaging of that phone probably done in China or one of its nearby neighbors. So when you think about, that's just one example of one good that we all use basically every day. So if you think about that as a way of conceiving of this really interconnected global economy, then economic security is complex because geopolitical tensions can mean that countries want to cut off or adjust those flows of resources between countries. It effectively gives them power over other countries politically and economically. So what do we do when we're so globally connected? That's something we'll probably get into in the interview today, but that's basically how I conceive of economic security. It's about how do we manage both the opportunities of these flows of resources between countries, but also the risks and the threats that can pose as well.
Great. Understanding what that means and what you just have told us, could you explore how China in particular might pose risks to the economic security of third countries like Australia, Colombia, or maybe Taiwan?
Certainly. In Australia's case, what's really, I guess, glaringly clear to our government is that China is actually our top export destination market. So it's very important to the Australian economy. Our prosperity at the moment really does hinge often on the price, for example, of minerals and iron ore that we dig up from the earth and that we send to China. It accounts for a lot of Australia's GDP. And then at the same time, Australia's major security ally is the United States. We also have a really significant investment relationship with the United States too. So we're sitting with this tension between having a really important economic relationship with China, an important economic relationship with the US as well, but also a very significant security relationship with the US. And for many decades, that wasn't really particularly a problem. But what's changed is what China wants, its plans for certainly the environment around China, but actually beyond that as well. So thinking here about their big military step up in the South China Sea, thinking about the plans for Taiwan, the democracy that lies off just to the coast of China. And much bigger than that, what China's plans are actually for the kind of rules and norms that it wants to see across the world. So it wants to see rules that would allow it, for example, to use more of its power and might in its economic relationships, for example, to get its way and to get what it wants. So countries, to some extent, are having to think about what that looks like compared to the sort of rules-based order that the US has led for many decades, which is changing, and it's not functioning exactly as it was, say, 50 years ago, but nevertheless is different to the sort of world that China's envisioning. Another example would be China's support for places like North Korea, or how it's supporting Russia in Ukraine. So this is an example of China deepening its economic and military partnerships with other countries. And we can imagine from that the sort of world that China wants to see, where it's really boosting those partners and the things that they want to do. So this affects Australia's security in particular in a number of ways. So we've got direct threats that come from that, things like possibly China banning our exports, which would have a big economic impact on Australia. Also things like blocking shipping lanes, thinking about the South China Sea and areas in East Asia that would affect countries like Australia really significantly and really directly. And then there are these indirect threats that I mentioned, the ways that China uses its economic relationships to pressure policymakers and also to reshape global institutions. And it is destabilizing regions. That's happening certainly in Asia, as you would imagine, close to where China is, but it's actually happening further than that as well. So this is making rules that actually protect countries, especially middle powers like Australia and Colombia, and smaller countries, arguably more important. We need more protections to make sure that we're not pressured into doing things that as countries we don't want to do.
Great. We also know that you're a part of the National Security Podcast. In one of their episodes, you analyze how the global economy is reshaping international security. I think you already talked a little bit about that in your later answer, but it would be great if you could share some more insights on that analysis, especially regarding China.
Yes, certainly. So in that podcast, I really discuss how this intertwining or these connections between economies around the world has made using economic policies and economic tools, as well as diplomatic tools and military and other ways of interacting between countries. But the economic tools have become more important. Often this is because we're trying to resolve differences and underpin friendships, but without having to use, for example, very expensive tools and costly tools like military force. So China really poses some critical challenges when you think about the economic tools it can use. It can use its trade policies and investment strategies. It's a very big, important, growing technological power to expand its influence. And of course, there are plenty of areas in which that isn't a big problem, and it's an area where we can all benefit. But there are key challenges when you do have this dependency on China because of what it wants and what it's willing to do to get what it wants. So I'm thinking here of sectors where China wields a lot of influence. That's often in areas like the real economy and also in China's global strategies to gain more influence globally, sometimes through things like infrastructure provision and investments, but also through its provision of really advanced, amazing, sometimes new technologies. So this has led countries like the US, Japan, parts of Europe to actually try to reduce some of their economic reliance on China. It can be costly and it can be hard to do, but it can actually in the long run make your economy more secure and resilient and more resistant to pressure. So the ways that you can do this, sometimes it can actually mean things like using an export control. So that's refusing to send certain technologies to China that could be used for military applications. But sometimes actually it's also about working together as countries, sharing information and sharing resources to make it safer to continue to have those resource flows with China, but in a way that reduces the sort of pressure that China can exert through those flows. So I'm thinking, for example, about areas where it doesn't always make a lot of economic insecurity sense to reduce economic exchange with China. Things like, really important consumer manufactured goods that China makes that aren't very sensitive from a technology perspective. There doesn't seem to be a good reason to stop those flows of resource exchange with China. But there are other areas where it probably does, things like critical minerals that are going to be very important for green and other technologies in the future. And those are areas where we might want to actually work more in partnerships and in groups to try and become more economically resilient together by doing more trade and resource sharing together. So I've noticed, for example, that in parts of South America, I've done research particularly on Paraguay, but also its relationships with its Mercosur partners, so with Chile, Brazil, and with Argentina. And I found there that there is an interesting dynamic of pressure between both China and also Taiwan wanting to have diplomatic ties with Asuncion. And I've noticed there that one benefit for Paraguay has been the Mercosur arrangement, which is not a perfect arrangement, but they do have very liberal flows, so few restrictions on trade and flows of resources between the Mercosur countries. Now that offers them a benefit because it does give them a team framework to work in when balancing pressures from, for example, China and Taiwan or China and the US. It gives them a way to group together to think both about responses to that pressure, but also to actually share resources and information just about what the pressures could be in the future. So that's one example of where it's not just about trying to restrict and cut off flows of trade with China, but being smarter about managing them together.
Great. I think here in Colombia, we don't have like the strongest relationship with China yet, but it has been growing. So for us, it's very important to take all those risks that you are talking about into account and be, as you say, resilient maybe in the closer future. But we have talked about today's contexts. What do you think if we talk about the possible solutions? How do you believe that economic and security policies in countries like Australia and maybe Colombia should evolve to balance international growth opportunities with the emerging threats of current geopolitical tensions, particularly those associated with the Chinese Communist Party?
Yes, I'm really glad you asked. And this is the area I try to spend quite a lot of time on in my research. So a first step is actually just recognizing that there is a challenge, both to anticipate the risks, but also to think about the opportunities that are out there that help to mitigate against those risks. Some of this really has to happen in governments, first of all, I would say. Sometimes the pressure can actually come from think tanks like yours to bring the issues to the government's attention. And then I think the first step is really within governments to start thinking through, what are our dependencies and vulnerabilities, but at the same time, what are our strengths? And when you've identified those and thought about the weaknesses, it helps give you some priorities to start thinking about becoming more economically resilient, to start reducing those security threats. I'm thinking here, for example, there are some countries we can look to that have done a great job of this. So Japan, for example, has a high-level group in its government that sits really up at the top, actually, of its bureaucratic structure. And that's an economic security group drawn with people from all across the government in Japan. And they sit in an economic security group thinking about these risks and also these opportunities of international economic exchange for Japan. It's maybe not surprising that this came out of Japan. When you think about Japan's situation, they are very close geographically to China. They have been dealing with a tense security, strategic relationship with China for a very long time. And Japan is also at great potential military risk. if China was going to escalate tensions or even use military force in its near abroad, Japan is right there. So this is a really serious defense issue for Japan, as well as it is an economic one, because Japan really relies on trade with China. It receives, lots of processed critical minerals for use in Japan's big car making, its automobile industry, and all across the Japanese economy. There's a lot of important economic exchange. So Japan's an interesting case to look at because they've had to think about economic security issues for a long time with respect to China. And they've also had to balance those economic dependencies they have against their very close and real potential military danger from China and China's plans for the region. So something like the Japan model can be very interesting for countries to consider, having this group of people that consider not just economic issues, but they also consider security issues of economic relationships. So I'd say that's step one. And then apart from just that work in government, a really important next step is thinking about sharing that information around and developing expertise. And that's where I see the private sector. This is where businesses and firms play a role. Because what I haven't mentioned yet is, of course, economic security, the front lines of it, is actually the firms and businesses that get affected by changes in economic policies and economic initiatives by different governments around the world. It's the businesses, it's the firms that actually deal with that on a day-to-day basis and that carry out the economic activity that happens between countries. So firms are the front line, and they need to both talk to government about what they are seeing and what their priorities are. And they also need to hear from the government about things like the geopolitical environment, the strategic environment, what's likely to happen if there was a disruption to global shipping. We saw an example of that during the pandemic, but that could also happen due to geopolitical tensions. And that's something the government and actually think tanks and academia are likely to have a bit more information and expertise in than your average business that's just thinking, of course, about their costs and profits and their everyday running a business. So think tanks and universities as well, I would say, play key roles in helping governments develop strategies to make themselves more resilient and secure. And then finally, a really important piece of this, and probably reflecting our conversation today, collaborations and talking to other countries and sharing expertise and information between countries is really important too. One of the ways to be really well protected and defended is to know what other countries are doing, the risk that they're seeing, and learning from each other's strategies, because sometimes there'll be strategies that maybe a country in Europe is using that would work really well, say in Colombia, or in Australia, there might be policies from somewhere like Singapore or Japan that work really well for us as well. So, I think Australia speaks a lot with countries like Colombia and with Chile, where we do have some similarities in parts of our economy, and we can learn from a lot from each other in that respect. So there's also the diplomatic and the bilateral engagement between our countries officially, but also through things like think tanks and universities, where we can share these ideas and expertise as well. That's important for economic security too.
Great. I think we at the ICP have a great compromise on fostering like this type of conversations and putting those risks in the public agenda here in Colombia. But to finish, Mrs. Mitchell, I want to ask you one last question. Which sectors do you consider more vulnerable to Chinese influence, and how might policymakers in countries like Australia and Colombia implement preventive strategies in these sectors specifically?
Yes. So this is part, I guess, of what I was mentioning about being able to anticipate risks and being able to think in advance about economic security. Look, in general, across the world, China is going to have a lot more influence and economic clout in areas where it has either, huge amounts of exports or investment, or in areas where it's a major player in terms of innovation. So I'm thinking about in the Australian context, Our agriculture sector, for example, is quite exposed to China, as of course are our commodities and raw materials exports. Those are also sometimes quite politically sensitive industries, and that's something to think about in this picture as well, that it's the combination often of where there are industries where there's a lot of economic exposure, but also where that would have a significant potential political impact. And I'll come back to that in the sort of the strategies response as well. That would be true certainly of places like Colombia, but looking at the Colombian economic profile, in that case, there's also some dependencies on the consumer side. So being big importers from China, in that case, there's also vulnerabilities in an economy like Colombia's through your imports, through the consumption side. And to the extent that those imports feed into production and your businesses, there'll be certain exposures there too. So but generally, beyond just Australia and Colombia, so thinking about how our economies and how our societies run today, there's actually a big technological component that is a sensitivity in basically every country in the world. And that top risk is our information flows and our information infrastructure. This is about how data and information run through all the sectors of our economy, but they also keep the lights on, and they run our things like our water provision services or our internet provision services. This is actually what keeps our economy up and running and daily life running smoothly in the modern world, because we rely so much on internet-based applications. We rely so much on infrastructure that is actually run by data and machines today. So the best example of this, I would say, would be when Australia decided to ban what it decided were high-risk sellers from China. This is firms like Huawei and ZTE. The government in Australia banned those sellers from our telecommunication system. At the time, the big high-profile case was for our 5G infrastructure. So parts of the Australian government said that they had identified that because of the close relationship between the Chinese Communist Party and its state-owned enterprises, and actually most private sector firms in China had this potential vulnerability of pressure from the Chinese government because of their close, actually codified into law relationships. That meant that Australia would potentially be very vulnerable if one of those firms with close links to the Chinese government was involved in such a core sensitive technology as 5G that really spreads out across the whole network of economic activities and daily life in any country. And so Australia decided that that risk couldn't actually be mitigated. We couldn't just let a firm like Huawei and ZTE in and then do things to contain their influence that run across the 5G network that underpins daily life. That was too big a risk. There wasn't anything that could mitigate it. So Australia decided to actually ban those Chinese companies from providing those services. I think countries that have made the decision to go with Chinese firms are now looking for ways to actually do things like use some Chinese products, but also look to other vendors from places like, just diversifying places like Europe, Japan, other providers, to try and make sure that there's not one firm from China that has control over all parts of the system. So those sort of preventive strategies can actually make our economies more resilient, and we can watch where our dependencies are. But as I mentioned in earlier questions, there's the risk and the threat side of the equation, and then there's also the opportunity side of the equation, where we can also, as governments and as influencers from outside government and academia and think tanks, we can also look for opportunities for where we can make our economies more resilient by actually being more proactive in markets. So by actually being innovative, by raising productivity, and by looking for new opportunities, even in this interconnected world where risks do exist, because that's actually part of building up national power as a country as well, is having your own firms and your own economic clout that make you more influential in your region and even beyond. So that's the economic side of those strategies. But I would also say there's a really important domestic, political, social issue as well to economic security. And that is about trust and communication. So one way that countries can use their economic tools to put pressure on others to try and get what they want actually depends on the other country not being strong enough politically to stand up to the pressure. So what can you do in response to that? You can actually think about domestic strategies that do build trust, that make sure that as a government, when you're thinking about your economic vulnerabilities, but also thinking about your society, basically it's trust and communication that underpin that. We talk in Australia a lot about social cohesion, and there are different ways of thinking about that in other countries. But really what it tends to come down to is about having that support at home from your citizens to do things like take economic security policies that might be a bit more expensive in the short term, but give you that economic resilience over the longer term. And coming back to that example I mentioned earlier, actually from South America, I found, for example, that Taiwan has been able to keep up its diplomatic partnership with Paraguay, which is very unusual these days. Most countries have diplomatic ties with China instead. But part of the reason that Paraguay has been able to keep up that relationship with Taiwan is because they really have been able to build up this level of social trust with Taiwan, partly through things like scholarship programs and training that Taiwan provides, and those people-to-people links that last for sometimes generations. So, for example, the current president of Paraguay went on a scholarship during his university days to Taipei, to Taiwan, and he really knows what that country is like. He learned there a lot about China as well, and China's plans and intentions for the region. And having those people-to-people links and that communication has meant that the president of Paraguay has, retained a lifelong understanding of what Taiwan is about and what benefits they can offer Paraguay, even as China puts a lot of pressure on to try and change that. And I think during the pandemic, during the COVID-19 pandemic, that was very evident in Paraguay. So China was really putting a lot more pressure on Paraguay at a very vulnerable time, as we know, for all countries in the world. And South America had a lot of challenges to deal with during the pandemic. So that was a time when China was using economic tools like offering lots of aid, donation of medical goods, things that Paraguay really needed. But there were strings that were attached to that. So China was offering these benefits to Paraguay, but it really wanted something in return. It wanted those diplomatic ties, and it didn't want Taiwan to keep up its partnership with Paraguay. So in that case, really a very defining feature of the reason that Paraguay stood strong, it received lots, of course, of donations of medical and foreign goods from places like Taiwan and the United States, and that helped. But part of the picture as well was that there's a very strong, cohesive community, basically, in Paraguay that supports Taiwan and knows what Taiwan's values and what Taiwan is all about. And they are resistant to wanting that extra influence from China in their society. So it's about economics, but it's also, of course, about politics and about societies as well. There are lessons in that for Colombia, for Australia, and for other countries as well.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Mitchell, for your time and for sharing with us such important insights. We also want to extend our gratitude to the Australian Embassy in Colombia for fostering this important conversation. We invite all those connected to us today to revisit our previous 3 episodes on the risks associated with the strong relationships with China, and to stay engaged with the Institute's work by following our social media channels or visiting our webpage, icpcolombia.org. Thank you very much.
Thank you.